Good evening. Thank you for coming, and welcome on behalf of YIVO and the Leo Beck Institute to the Center for Jewish History. My name's William Weitzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Beck Institute. And on behalf of myself and Jonathan Brent, who is sorry he could not be here tonight and sends his regards, we're very happy to have Jack Jacobs here tonight. Most of you know this, but we've got some YIVO people and some Leo Beck people here, so I'll tell you about both institutions because we're both celebrating significant birthdays. YIVO was founded in 1925, so they're celebrating their 90th birthday. Their mission is to study the 1,000-year history of Jewish life in Eastern Europe and Russia. The Leo Beck Institute was founded in 1955, so this is our 60th birthday. And our mission is to preserve and promote the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry. I'm sure you'll agree that tonight's program fits well with both of our missions. Jack Jacobs, Professor of Political Science at John Jay College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, will be speaking about his new book, about the Frankfurt School. And I won't say much more about Jack because Marion is going to introduce him. Marion is the Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at NYU, Marian Kaplan, and a 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner. She's edited books on German history, German Jewish history, European women's history, and has taught in all those topics as well. Marion's going to introduce Jack, after which Jack will speak. Then Marion and Jack will run a question and answer session. We look forward to your questions. And after we stop that, the conversation will continue as we have a reception up in the Great Hall. And Jack will be selling books and signing books, or will be selling books and Jack will sign them. So let's get going. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. It's a particular pleasure for me to do this since Jack is also not just a scholarly colleague and friend, but a friend. Jack Jacobs is a professor of political science at John Jay College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He's the author of On Socialists and the Jewish Question, after Marx. He's also the author of Bundist, Counterculture in Interwar Poland, and the editor of Jewish Politics in Eastern Europe, The Bund at 100. Also, too many articles to mention. Professor Jacobs was a Fulbright Scholar at Tel Aviv University in 1996 and 97, and was also a Fulbright Scholar at the Vilnius Yiddish Institute in 2009. His work has been translated into French, German, Hebrew, Italian, Japanese, Polish, Russian, and Yiddish. He is currently editing a volume on Jews and the left, which will contain fresh new articles by a number of leading academic figures, and which will, like the book we will learn about tonight, The Frankfurt School, Jewish Lives and Antisemitism, be published by Cambridge University Press. Jack will be the Padnos Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor this coming fall 2016 semester, and will also serve as the Jacob Cronehill Visiting Professor at YIVO here for the spring of 2017. That will be an exciting year, I'm sure. And now I'd like Jack Jacobs to take this stage.
Thank you, first of all, Marion. My thanks as well to Billy Weitzer and the staff of the Leo Beck Institute, and to Jonathan Brent and the staff of the YIVO, and thanks to all of you for attending. I'm going to do a formal talk about half an hour long, and then I'm hoping that we'll have an informal, dialectical back-and-forth exchange. The Institute of Social Research, which was established in Frankfurt in 1923, was manifestly never an explicitly Jewish institution. It initially concerned itself primarily with topics related to the labor movement, socialism, economic history. In the period beginning with 1930, during which Max Horkheimer served as the Institute's director, and which is the era during which critical theory crystallized, The Institute was characterized first and foremost by a desire to promote interdisciplinary research on major questions. Hardly any of the articles published in the Institute's most important periodical, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, touched on Jewish subjects. The Institute per se did not devote sustained attention to Jewish matters during the Weimar years. And yet, in three very different eras, that is to say, not only in the years of the Weimar Republic, but also in the years of the Third Reich and in the decades following the end of the Second World War, Jewish matters had a significant effect on key members of the Institute. At some points, the Jewish family backgrounds of leading members of the Frankfurt School clarify their life paths. At other points, these backgrounds help us to understand the issues on which the leaders of the school chose to focus, and even the content of some of their ideas. In the decades after the Holocaust, the differing relationships of critical theorists to their Jewish origins and to Judaism help to explain their stances toward Israel and the distinctive natures of their modes of analysis of that topic. I hasten to underscore that I do not believe that critical theory is a Jewish theory any more than that psychoanalysis is a Jewish science. The latter assertion was a Nazi calumny. The former is deeply suspect, and yet it is my contention that the lives of key members of the Frankfurt School's founding generation are illuminated by situating these men, and they were all men, in multiple contexts, including that of Jewish history. But my talk today is not going to be centered on this assertion as such. Rather, I'm going to focus on a discrete period, the years following the establishment of the State of Israel, and I'm going to be exploring all but exclusively the positions of the critical theorists on Israel in the final decades of their lives. Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Max Horkheimer, and Leo Lowenthal, who were closely associated at various points with the Frankfurt School, were all of Jewish origin, were all members of the same generational cohort, were all born and raised in Germany, and were all among those who succeeded in surviving the Nazi era by leaving the land of their birth. None of these men was sympathetic to Zionism in the period immediately preceding the Second World War. These similarities notwithstanding, subtle variations appeared in their attitudes towards the State of Israel, and it's my contention that the views of all of these writers on Israel were heavily influenced by their relationships to their Jewish family backgrounds or to Judaism itself. It's also my contention that there was an inverse relation among members of the school between knowledge of Jewish religious ideas and criticism of Israel. The deeper the thinker's familiarity with Judaism, the stronger the thinker's critique of that country. Herbert Marcuse's family, first of all, maintained affiliations and observed Jewish religious traditions in a manner quite typical for German Jews of their time, place, and class. Herbert's family attended synagogue in Berlin, the city in which Herbert was born and raised, albeit only on Jewish high holidays. His parents made sure that their children received Jewish religious instruction, but this instruction does not appear to have evoked any particular interest in Judaism per se in Herbert. Herbert reportedly attended synagogue indifferently, resistantly, and only under moral compulsion. Moreover, he did not continue to receive instruction in matters related to Judaism after 1911, that is the year in which, at age 13, he became a bar mitzvah. In all of these ways, the relationship of the Marcuses to Jewish matters followed patterns which were unexceptional. Almost all German Jewish families in the neighborhood in which Herbert was raised were undergoing acculturation at the beginning of the 20th century. Herbert's family, Herbert himself insisted, was integrated into German society, and by his own account, his upbringing was no different than that of other German upper-middle-class youth. When asked, decades after he had left Germany, how he defined himself as a Jew, Marcuse replied, "That's one question I haven't been able to answer. I don't go around defining myself. I'm Jewish by tradition and culture, but if culture includes dietary laws and the Bible is holy writ, then I can't be classified that way." But then he adds immediately thereafter, "I've always defined myself as a Jew when Jews were unjustly attacked." On the same occasion, those interviewing Marcuse also asked him, "How do you view the Jewish people?" And Marcuse's answer reads in part, "My nationality is not Jewish, but U.S. If I lived in Israel, I'd be Jewish or Israeli or whatever you want to call it." Marcuse was not what Isaac Deutscher once called a non-Jewish Jew, though it may well be fair to describe him using George Mossey's alternative term as a German Jew beyond Judaism. There was clearly a Jewish element to Marcuse's sense of himself, albeit of a very specific sort. He was secular. However, Marcuse was by no means wholly lacking in Jewish consciousness. Michael Lerner, now the editor of Tikkun, was editor of the Berkeley chapter of Students for a Democratic Society in 1965. He visited with Marcuse at that time, and he eventually developed a friendship with him. In the 1970s, Lerner, who had, as a young man, attended the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York, Lerner used to lead Shabbos services for a group in Berkeley. Marcuse was in Berkeley regularly during that period, and, Lerner has told me, would sometimes come to those services, though, and I quote, "often to argue rather than to daven." On at least one occasion, Herbert hosted a Passover Seder. Professor Shlomo Avineri of Hebrew University, who attended a Seder at Herbert's home in 1979, described it to me as a very normal one, with Haggadah, etc. Marcuse's Jewish background played a significant role in the development of his positions on Zionism and Israel. In the summer of 1967, shortly after the Six-Day War, Marcuse traveled to Berlin at the invitation of a German New Left organization, and he participated in a series of discussions in the city of his birth. In the course of those discussions, Marcuse noted, and I'm quoting him directly, "You will understand that I have personal, though not only personal, feelings of solidarity and identification with Israel. I must see more than a personal prejudice in this solidarity. I cannot forget that for centuries the Jews belonged to the persecuted and oppressed, that not too long ago 6 million of them were annihilated. When finally a place is to be created for these people where they will not need to fear persecution and oppression, that is a goal with which I must declare my sympathy." I agree with Jean-Paul Sartre, who has said that under all circumstances, a new war of annihilation against Israel must be prevented. And he finished these remarks by criticizing specific Israeli policies and then adding, "The fact is that Arabs in official positions have loudly and explicitly declared that there must be a war of annihilation against Israel. It's under these circumstances that the preventive war of 1967, which is what it was, against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, must be understood and evaluated." In December of 71, Marcuse traveled to Israel as a guest of the Van Leer Institute, a prestigious mainstream institution based in Jerusalem. He delivered a number of talks while in Israel. Speaking in Haifa before a capacity crowd, Marcuse indicated that while he personally did not define the Jews as a nation, quote, if you define the Jewish people as a nation, then Zionism is a national liberation movement, end quote. When a student asked Marcuse about immigration by Jews to Israel, Marcuse said, I'm trying to support every effort to prevent persecution. One way to help persecuted Jews is to let them come to Israel, and I'm in favor of that. And when he was asked if he would himself consider immigrating to Israel, he replied, while smiling, it all depends on what goes on in this country. Marcuse also noted that he did not understand the New Left as contesting the right of the State of Israel to exist as a sovereign state, and he stressed, as a Jew, I have the right to criticize the government of the Jewish state. During the course of his visit to Israel, Haaretz published an interview with Marcuse conducted by Uzi Ben-Zimon. Ben-Zimon asked Marcuse about his feelings as a Jew, and Marcuse said, I have a Jewish identity in the context of the expected dangers of the persecution of Jews. I have a difficult time identifying myself with them when they are the persecutors. I sense a connection to the cultural socialist German heritage, and in the same manner, I feel a connection to the period in which the United States fought the Nazis. I have many loyalties. And he ended this interview by stating explicitly, this is an important one, it's obvious I am against statements such as those which call for the destruction of Israel. So where does this leave us? There was a Jewish component to Marcuse's sense of himself, but it was most definitely a secular rather than a religious component. Moreover, he was not necessarily inclined to characterize himself as Jewish first and foremost in all instances. He had German and American strands to his identity, which existed alongside the Jewish strand, and one or another of these was, at many specific points in his life, more important to him than was his Jewish ancestry. He didn't evince a strong interest in anti-Semitism from a theoretical perspective, but he was well aware, in the wake of the Holocaust, that anti-Semitism could be extremely dangerous, and he supported the existence of Israel, given the demonstrated need, in his opinion, for a place of asylum for Jews fleeing actual or potentially anti-Semitic milieus. Marcuse's stance vis-a-vis Israel, finally, was linked by him to his Jewishness. Precisely because he thought of himself as a Jew, he believed he was entitled to state his criticisms of Israeli policy. But even in the last decade of his life, Marcuse differentiated quite clearly between the policies of Israeli governments and the rationale for the existence of Israel, opposing the former in a number of instances, while steadfastly defending the need for a place of refuge. Herbert Marcuse's rather sympathetic stance towards Israel, I conclude, was manifestly influenced by his Jewish background, but it was precisely his lack of attachment to Jewish religious belief or traditions which led him to have a different and, in many respects, somewhat softer stance towards the Jewish state than did his one-time colleagues in the Frankfurt School, whose views ranged along a continuum. Erich Fromm, who had grown up in an Orthodox milieu and who was far more learned about Judaism than the other members of this grouping, was also the most critical of the continued existence of Israel post-1948. Unlike Marcuse's family, the Fromms were strictly observant throughout the period of Erich's childhood and adolescence. Fromm was active in his teenage years. He was indeed a leader of the Kartell Jüdische Verbindungen, a Zionist student organization, and he was also active in the Jüdischer Wanderbund Blau-Weiß. He played a role in the development of Frankfurt's famous Lehrhaus, which provided adult education on Jewish themes. He studied Talmud over a period of years, initially with Yankov Horowitz and later with Ludwig Krauss. While a student in Heidelberg in the early 1920s, he studied daily with Zalman Baruch-Rabenkopf. In the mid-1920s, as Fromm became ever more intensely interested in and involved with psychoanalysis, he underwent a period of secularization. Long after he had ceased to observe Jewish religious law or to intensely study Jewish religious texts, however, Fromm continued to be deeply affected by those from whom he had learned about Judaism. In his book, You Shall Be as Gods, published in 1966, Fromm, referring explicitly to his teachers, notes, "Not being a practicing or a believing Jew, I am, of course, in a very different position from theirs, and least of all would I dare make them responsible for the views expressed in this book. Yet my views have grown out of their teaching, and it's my conviction that at no point has the continuity between their teaching and my own views been interrupted." In the same year, he informed a friend, "Although I have removed myself from the practice of Judaism, I have not removed myself from its spirit and have a deep respect and love for its practice." So what then were Fromm's views on Israel after the establishment of the state? As early as 1950, Fromm wrote that the claim that the state is a fulfillment of Jewish messianic hopes is not only unjustifiable, but contradicts the most fundamental principles and values of Jewish tradition. In the late 50s, he worked actively to transform Israel into what he called a truly binational state. Whereas Marcuse's first inclination at the time of the 67 war had been to voice solidarity with Israel, as we have seen, Fromm tellingly detailed strong misgivings at that time. In a private letter to a friend, for example, written very shortly after the end of that war, he expressed sadness, quote, about the actions of the Israeli government, their flaunting of the UN, their use of napalm bombs, the plans to create an Arab satellite in West Jordan, which reminds me, he wrote, of the apartheid program of the South Africans, end quote. Fromm remained a harsh critic of Israel in later years. One of his strongest remarks on Israel dates from 1972, and it reads as follows: "Hitler destroyed half the Jewish people physically, but I'm afraid the Zionist state is destroying the very essence of Judaism by its claims of representing the messianic solution. Its militarism, its arrogance, its lack of respect for the Arabs, which aroused the admiration of the American military and reactionary circles, is indeed the exact opposite of prophetic teaching. And more than that, by this policy, Israel is one of the greatest dangers to world peace. As long as the world is as it is, each individual, whether Jewish or not, is, I believe, an exile. And from the traditional standpoint, the Jewish people must be an exile too, as he informed his lifelong friend Ernst Simon in 1976, I am against the idea of a state as such. Erich Fromm, in sum, who had been a religiously observant Jew throughout his childhood and young adult years, who had engaged in deep and sustained study of traditional Jewish texts, who retained a strong emotional affinity for specific components of the Jewish religious tradition long after he stopped practicing Judaism in general, I am arguing that it was precisely these affinities and his interpretations of Jewish religious tradition which led Fromm to condemn Israeli policies and to continue to avow his very strong criticisms of the existence of Israel itself. Other key members of the Frankfurt School did not agree with Fromm's position, but also staked out positions which differed from those of Herbert Marcuse. Very briefly, both Max Horkheimer and Leo Lowenthal expressed views on Israel which were in important respects between those of Marcuse on the one hand and those of Fromm on the other. Max Horkheimer, the pivot around whom the Frankfurt School per se initially coalesced, had considerably less substantive knowledge of Jewish texts than did Fromm, but was nevertheless influenced by specific Jewish ideas. In general, the Horkheimer family had practiced Judaism during Max's childhood years, though, unlike the Fromms, not in a strictly Orthodox manner. Horkheimer remembered having gone to synagogue services with his father very sentimentally. He did have a bar mitzvah, and it can be safely presumed that he received at least as much of a Jewish education as would make it possible for him to participate in that coming-of-age ceremony. Horkheimer didn't support Zionism in the period before the creation of the state, and he didn't support it afterwards. Horkheimer's misgivings about Zionism and Israel did not preclude him from making charitable donations to various organizations with Zionist or pro-Zionist perspectives in the late 60s and in the 70s, or even, occasionally, joining pro-Zionist bodies. He made financial contributions, for example, to the Women's International Zionist Organization and to Keren HaYesod. The precipitating causes for his financial contributions to Keren Kayemet, the Jewish National Fund, are quite striking. Horkheimer made such donations at two fraught moments in his life. When, in 1971, Friedrich Pollack, Horkheimer's oldest friend and a stalwart member of the Frankfurt School throughout his adult life, passed away, Horkheimer thought it a fitting tribute to donate funds to the Jewish National Fund in honor of Pollack, despite the fact that Pollack had never had a strong Jewish identity of any kind and never manifested any particular sympathy for Zionism or Israel. In the following year, Horkheimer made a contribution to the Jewish National Fund to mark the death of his wife, Maydon, who was not of Jewish origin and who had never been to Israel. We can only speculate as to why Horkheimer chose to mark the deaths of his spouse and his oldest friend in such a manner, but I would venture to guess that Horkheimer wanted to link profoundly felt losses with what he perceived as a positive and progressive phenomenon. Do these donations indicate a fundamental alteration in his attitudes towards the state of Israel? I don't think so. However symbolically important gestures like these may be, Horkheimer's stance vis-a-vis Israel continued throughout the remainder of his life to be impacted upon by his sense that the state was not fully in accord with the deepest teachings of the Jewish religious tradition as he understood them. Israel is an afflicted land, Horkheimer proclaimed in an interview that was published in 1970, just as the Jews were always afflicted. One can't oppose the establishment of the state because otherwise all too many people would not know where they ought to flee. This is for me the decisive point. Israel, the asylum for many people. This notwithstanding, it appears to me not to be easy to reconcile it with the prophecies of the Old Testament. Horkheimer's interviewer summarized what he had just heard by stating that, on the one hand, you think that the state of Israel is needed as a place of refuge. On the other hand, this state ought to lead to the realization of a Jewish utopia, Zion, the description or presentation of which is hardly less problematic than the image of the Supreme Being. Here, parallels to your critical theory can quickly be made, and Horkheimer's one-word comment on this summary was, certainly. Horkheimer's critique of Israel, in other words, was rooted not so much in specific policies of the state as in his understanding of prophetic tradition and of the ways in which the creation of Israel conflicted with that tradition. He was willing to take political steps to defend Israel, and he distanced himself from political anti-Zionism, but he also had deep misgivings to the end of his days. Lowenthal's attitude, finally, I'm in the home stretch, was similar to that of Horkheimer. On the other hand, Lowenthal, who was a close friend of Marcuse's in the 1960s and 70s, certainly agreed with some components of Marcuse's view on matters related to Israel. In comments by Lowenthal on Israel, as in those by Marcuse, we find both willingness to defend the continued existence of the state and disapprobation for specific Israeli policies. Another indication of similarities between their stances is the fact that, unlike Horkheimer or Fromm, Marcuse and Lowenthal both happily accepted invitations to visit Israel. However, Lowenthal was explicitly concerned with tension between the reality of the actually existing state and Jewish messianic traditions. Marcuse was not. Moreover, Lowenthal, but not Marcuse, made reference to Horkheimer's views when explicating his position. On the issue of Israel and on lots of other matters related to critical theory, Lowenthal's stance was closer to that of Horkheimer than it was to that of Marcuse. Lowenthal's correspondence from the 1960s and from later decades makes it crystal clear that Lowenthal, who knew people living in Israel, was concerned about them and was empathetic. Immediately following the Six-Day War, a point of similarity for all of these thinkers, right? Lowenthal wrote to his cousin, Aryeh ben David, who lived in Jerusalem, that he had been extremely worried about the fate of family and friends during the war, and that he believed, or at least hoped, that in the long run, wisdom and moderation would prevail on both sides. But Lowenthal found that he could not fully reconcile the state of Israel with the utopian messianic messages which he had embraced in his youth, at which time Leo had, at least for a while, rejected the assimilationist stance of his father and for several years lived a religiously observant lifestyle. Lowenthal's engagement with Judaism was not as long-lasting as was that of Fromm, nor was it as deep. However, traces of Lowenthal's study of Judaism in the early 1920s remained with him throughout the rest of his life and helped to explain Lowenthal's position on Israel. Much of that which the Jews in the so-called diaspora and also in Israel do, Lowenthal proclaimed in an interview which appeared in 1989, at which point he was almost 90, I see as in contradiction to the prophetic messianic heritage. So I'm finishing up. There was, in the case of key members of the Frankfurt School, something of an inverse relationship between knowledge of Judaism and attitudes towards the existence of Israel. Fromm, the critical theorist with the strongest grounding in Judaism, was also the theorist most inclined to continue to doubt the desirability or the necessity of the state in the post-Holocaust era. Marcuse, who was least Jewishly knowledgeable of those critical theorists I have discussed tonight, was also least inclined to continue to raise fundamental questions about the existence of the state per se. Horkheimer and Lowenthal occupied a middle position, more familiar with Judaism than Marcuse, less familiar with Judaism than Fromm. Unlike Marcuse, both were uneasy about the relationship between Israel and specific Jewish religious traditions. Unlike Fromm, on the other hand, they most definitively did not oppose the continued existence of the Jewish state at any point after its creation. There were a number of sharp and cross-cutting differences among the members of the Frankfurt School in the post-Holocaust era. Matters pertaining to Israel were by no means the cause of the fissures which were manifest in the post-Holocaust era among the members of what had at one time been a circle of thinkers. But the issue of Israel was an emotionally significant one for all of these theorists. Their relationships to Judaism and or to their Jewish family backgrounds impacted upon the critical theorists not only in the Weimar era and in the exile years, but also, as I have attempted to demonstrate this evening, in the last decades of their lives. A note as I conclude. I take pains to stress that my contentions that the life paths of key members of the Institute were Jewish and that some of the critical theorists were ultimately influenced in specific instances by Jewish ideas notwithstanding, I disagree rather strongly with those major discussions of critical theorists which accent the relationship of critical theory as such to Judaism. Critical theory provides important insights into society. These insights are neither negated nor confirmed by research on the biographies of the critical theorists, and nevertheless, the history of the Frankfurt School must be situated in multiple contexts, including that of Jewish history. One can't explain critical theory by reference solely to Judaism, but one can't explain the lives of the Frankfurt School's key writers without grappling with Jewish matters. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's take a seat.
So now there's an opportunity for the audience to ask questions, and someone will have a microphone, I think. Yes? Okay, and while you're all gathering your questions, I have one that I can maybe start with. So in the 1920s, Pua Rakowski, who was an ardent feminist and Yiddishist and socialist and Zionist from Poland, visited Mandatory Palestine. And she was hoping to be very enthusiastic, but in the end she was concerned because she saw or felt that the leaders had contempt for Yiddish, for Arabs, and for the diaspora. Now, I'm curious of these men, whether any of them, you've already mentioned that, I think it was Marcuse. Was Marcuse worrying about the Arab situation and the apartheid? That was him. I wonder if...
That was Fromm.
That was Fromm, sorry. Okay, Fromm. So I'm just wondering if they all took a stance on, I guess not on Yiddish, but I wonder if they took a stance on the Arab situation, on the diaspora, while the rest of you are thinking about your questions.
So my first response would be, our friend, the late Paula Hyman, wrote very, very extensively about Rakowski and about that trip and about the significance of it, and it was a wonderful, wonderful study. And I would note here that, Rakowski came from a very different world than the world of the people who I am describing. None of these people came from a Yiddish-speaking background. None of these people had ties to East European Jewish culture. And it's also, at the same time, sort of on the other hand, to point out that there were many, many different kinds of relationships to Zionism and anti-Zionism, both in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. There were anti-Zionists in Eastern Europe, and there were anti-Zionists in Central Europe. There were pro-Zionists in Eastern Europe, and there were pro-Zionists in Central Europe. Of the men who I have described here tonight, I would say that 3 of the 4 explicitly discussed the question of the Arabs, even at an early point in the 1920s. Lowenthal wrote an article on that issue under an assumed name for a Jewish newspaper in the 1920s. Fromm became intensely interested in that issue at a marginally later point in time. Marcuse, as I have suggested, was not someone who was interested in or involved with Jewish affairs in the pre-war period. But after the creation of the state, he too was certainly interested in, concerned by the relationship between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, as we would call them today. So far as I know, Horkheimer did not address that issue directly, at least not in the early decades.
So now everybody else has had a chance. Judy?
I was wondering if you could elucidate a little bit the teachings, just a few specifics that influenced from, and I know you said the Jewish prophetic tradition, and I'm not totally sure how that relates.
Right. So one of the Jewish teachings that I think was actually quite important to critical theory and to the Frankfurt School was the prohibition against graven images. They insisted all along, long before they were willing to acknowledge what the origins of this notion was, that it was not part of their task to depict what the future would look like, to point out in detail what the future socialist society would be. Their task was to critique that which existed and to explain that which existed. In the 1920s and 1930s, Horkheimer himself would have held at arm's length the notion that that idea comes from Jewish teachings. In the latter part of his life, repeatedly, when speaking to interviewers and others, he said, this is a Jewish teaching. We ought not worship idols. We ought not engage in this practice of creating graven images. And that was how Horkheimer and Lowenthal perceived the Zionist project at the later point in their life that I was describing here.
In the middle? Wait a second so that you can use the mic. Thank you.
Was Adorno Jewish, and if so, what about him? He certainly was a key member of the Frankfurt School.
Adorno was in part of Jewish origin. I don't like to use the Nazi term half-Jew, okay, but he was in part of Jewish origin, and he was very close as a child and as a young man to his deeply Catholic mother and to his deeply Catholic aunt. And in the Weimar years, he did not identify with his Jewish family background, and he did not associate with any Jewish organizations. And he actually had derogatory comments to make about those of his colleagues who did. He said quite dismissive things in this connection about Lowenthal and Fromm, who were directly associated with Jewish institutions in Weimar. However, and this is a very important however, the Nazi years altered his sense of himself and his relationship to his father's family background. When the Nazi years began, Adorno actually thought that because he was using his mother's maiden name, his father's name had actually been Wiesengrund, because he was calling himself Adorno, because he had already established himself as a writer in non-Jewish circles, etc., he would be able to slip by. He would be able to continue to write, stay in Germany, keep quiet, and he tried until, of course, it became absolutely impossible. He was prevented from writing for anyone at all. Nazi law made it impossible for him to continue the career that he had hoped to continue. And so he goes first to England to finish his education, and then, at Horkheimer's explicit invitation, comes to the States. And when he arrives in the States, and this is a key part of my book, though not something that I spoke about today, it is above all Adorno that convinces Horkheimer and the Institute that they must do theoretical work on the meaning of anti-Semitism, that they must explain the rise of anti-Semitism that had occurred. And as the Holocaust unfolds, more and more and more, Adorno came to identify himself with the victims, with the Jewish victims above all. And though it would be fair to say that his attitude towards his Jewishness remained complex, his family background was complex, by the end of his life, he often referred to himself as a Jew.
Here in front.
Thanks for your talk. It's very interesting. I have two questions.
Can you hang on 1 second? The mic is coming. Sorry.
I said thank you, and I have two questions. The New Left by 1971, the white New Left and the black New Left, the Panthers and groups like that, were virulently anti-Israel by then. And Marcuse had a huge effect on the New Left, certainly the white New Left. I'm wondering if you know of any occasions where he engaged in debates, conversations, discussions, because he had sort of a steady stream of new leftists coming to talk to him. He was sort of a guru for a lot of people.
Yeah. I would say a couple of things about that. The first thing that I would say is that Marcuse himself very much disliked being thought of as the father of the New Left. He over and over again said, no. It's also true that though many people made use of his name, I'm not so sure how many people actually read Eros and Civilization or One-Dimensional Man. But did he engage with members of the New Left, both white and black, on this issue? Absolutely, most definitively. Peter Marcuse, Herbert's son, is sitting here in the same row as you, and Peter can speak to some of these issues better than I. But I knew Ricky. I knew Ricky Sherover, to whom Herbert was married in the latter years of his life, and Ricky was herself part of the Jewish New Left. I first met Ricky in the context of New Jewish Agenda. I was on the organizing committee for New Jewish Agenda. I remember Ricky coming to the first meetings and conferences. I remember hanging out in her hot tub in the East Bay. I do. I remember it very, very explicitly. And what I could say is there's simply no question that there was a circle of Jewish New Leftists. Lerner was also one of them. There were many other names that one can mention that would talk about these issues with Herbert. And I suspect, and here comes my punchline, that in the case of Ricky, she influenced him. That is to say, that her increasing Jewish consciousness, her increasing identification with her Jewishness. She was part of the group that used to be called in those days reevaluation co-counseling. As she went through the reevaluation co-counseling process, she increasingly began to become interested in Jewish affairs. And I suspect, for example, though they're both gone and I can't ask them, that Seder I referred to in Herbert's home was actually Ricky's idea. And I suspect that the growing understanding on Herbert's part of the significance of anti-Semitism, which he had not had in the Weimar years, also has something to do not with what he said to the New Left, but what, for example, Ricky said to him, right? It's a two-way relationship. And as to the relationship to the black New Left, I've actually tried to get the correspondence between Angela and Herbert, and so far Angela has not been forthcoming, but, I'm not giving up quite yet.
Thank you. I had one more question, if I could. The Frankfurt School theorists were Jewish, but they were also very German, and they were very bourgeois Germans. And Israel, of course, was not a European country. It was very, especially in the early years, it's very Spartan. It's very Asiatic, if you want to use that term. Arendt was repelled by how much Tel Aviv was like Istanbul. She thought it was disgusting. And I'm wondering if you have any research on how their Germanness affected their views of Israel.
I can answer it more generally. And I could say that you're certainly correct in saying that all of these people were very German in their culture, in their outlook, in their upbringing, even in their interests. And when the war ended, Horkheimer and Adorno and their good friend Friedrich Pollock, who I mentioned only by reference to his death, decided to go back and decided to live in Germany. And they thought that their task would be to help raise a new, younger generation of Germans who would have a relationship to their Germanness that was different than that of their parents, so to speak. And they felt a commitment to those of their students who had been non-Jewish, who had remained behind. But they became very, very disappointed over time. All of them, Horkheimer, Adorno, and Pollock. Horkheimer retired early, and in large part it was because he felt the anti-Semitism all around him in Frankfurt. He was a very prominent intellectual and academic leader with an important position at the university. He was also a public figure who engaged in many, many different issues. And yet he knew very well that his colleagues used to refer to Adorno as the Wiedergutmachungsprofessor, the reparations professor. And he knew very well that there were lots and lots of people who were none too happy that he and Adorno were there. And so he left Germany more or less as soon as he could. That is to say, as soon as he reached retirement age, he petitioned to leave, and he did, and he went to Switzerland. And I have spoken with people, Jewish people, who knew him in Switzerland, young German Jews who would go to Switzerland, and what they say to me is that his advice to them was, don't stay. And as to Adorno, who, as I've mentioned, was only partially of Jewish origin, his phrase for what it was like for him to live in Germany, the land of his birth, the place of his culture, his language, his phrase was, I'm living in the house of the hangman. I'm living in the house of the hangman. It's very strong. So, were they German? Sure. Were they zu Hause in Germany?